Hey everyone, I'm Paul Muller, the host of the AI Forecast, a weekly podcast sponsored by Cloudera, where we explore the past, present and future of data and AI in the enterprise. And as always, we're joined by leading companies and industry experts. Well, today we're exploring not one, but two of my favorite topics. We're going to start by taking a real world look at some use cases for AI in an industry that certainly surprised me. Building construction, folks. Yes. Before moving on to discussing the role of government in the regulation of AI adoption. Do they have a role? Should they have a role? To what extent and at what levels? These and many more questions we'll be tackling today. And to do that, our guest is CEO and founder of Togal.AI, a company that leverages AI to streamline construction processes alongside its sister company, CodeComply.AI, a company that uses AI to fast track the often tricky process of building permit approvals. So like I said, unexpected. But as I said, it's a double header. He's also a former US Congressman where he represented Palm Beach and the Treasure Coast from 2013 to 2017. And during his tenure, he sat on President Biden's expert council and gave recommendations on the use of AI in the United States. Welcome to the podcast, Patrick Murphy.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
It's great to have you on. Hey, before we get into, as I said, we've got a wide-ranging set of topics today. We like to start each podcast episode with something we call the lightning round, the fast four.
Okay.
A chance for people to get to know you through a slightly different lens. You ready to do this?
Sure. Let's dive in.
Let's make it happen. All right. First up, what would people who know you best say is your superpower?
Probably hard work. Just stubborn Irish, kind of work through anything. If not that, maybe being able to take a lot of information and try to compress it to something that's digestible or usable.
Yeah, very useful in this day and age. Although I have to say, I think ChatGPT is coming for your job.
I know. I think being outworked and outsmarted.
What's the most impactful technology of all time, in your opinion?
Whew, I mean, hard to beat electricity or the internet, but I would say I think AI is going to certainly going to give the internet a run for its money.
Speaking of AI, we all talk about, the flying car side of AI for, and its impact on society. We'll talk about it today. But what would you personally like to see AI automate for you?
My expenses, scheduling. No, look, I think, gosh, there's so many tedious things we all do and probably don't even realize day to day how much time we're spending just answering silly emails, deleting things, scheduling. I think AI is going to become very, very good at that in the next few years. And I think that's going to enable us just to be more productive humans in whatever it is that we're doing. So looking forward to that.
Yeah, look, I'll get my AI to meet your AI and we can skip this meeting completely.
Exactly. It'll give better answers anyway. So,
last but not least, as I've said on the podcast before, in 20, 30 something years of working in business, I've learnt that I had some unconscious hacks that I use to help me best deal with data. What are some of the sort of best practices, tips or tricks? What's helped you get through life when it comes to data?
Gosh, I'd say in our AI companies, that saying of garbage in, garbage out has never been more true. If you don't sanitize the data, if you don't take the time to organize it and label it correctly in a very consistent manner, you're never going to have the outputs you need. And in our particular case, and we'll talk about this more, I'm sure, what we're disrupting in construction is very nuanced. There's a ton of detail in construction plans, and they're all different, right? There's basically no two buildings alike unless it's some, housing community where the houses are the same, but basically everything is different. Different architects, different engineers, different subs and contractors and building codes, right? So understanding that nuance is very complicated. So having very organized data that's labeled consistently is so important. And there's going to be all sorts of other industries disrupted, but you got to have that. Those fundamentals have to be right.
On that note, let's get on to the show. How exactly does a congressman find themselves at the intersection of AI and construction? I've got to admit, you got me stumped.
Great question. They're actually very similar, believe it or not, and happy to shed light on that analogy. But quick background, I was raised in a family construction business. My grandfather was a painter. My dad started a construction company, so I worked in all aspects of construction. CPA by training, worked at a large accounting firm, Deloitte. and then served in Congress. And at the time, I was the youngest member of Congress. So I was spending a lot of time thinking about the future of work and how the government should be preparing for the jobs of tomorrow. Got exposed to AI back in 2013 and all sorts of new technologies. Fast forward, I rejoined our family construction business, and we've been blessed to now grow to become the largest general contractor in Florida, building all sorts of high rises and big buildings. But what I realized is very few things had changed, right? It was the same old processes that were very antiquated. And I'm sure you've seen or maybe experienced this firsthand, but they say over the last 50 years, productivity has been a 0% increase in construction. Right, zero. Every other industry is 2x, 3x, manufacturing is 10x. Construction's remained flat, right? So you look at it and you say, holy cow, I mean, there's got to be a better way to do things. So I started going through our financials and realized that the single biggest piece of overhead in our construction company, similar to most construction companies, is estimating, right? Everything that goes into bidding on a job. And when I was a kid, we used to use a scale ruler like this, right? I'd sit there with my grandfather and we'd measure plans. And you have to get quantities of everything before you can give a price. Well, 20 years ago, people started using a mouse, right, to do it. But nothing's changed. So that's when the light bulb went off in 2019, that if a human can look at a set of plans and determine the difference in a bedroom and a bathroom and a hallway or whatever it is, so can a computer if you train it correctly. So the idea, of course, was to compress weeks, 2 or 3 weeks of work down to 2 or 3 seconds. And we knew that AI would ultimately be more accurate than a human because it doesn't get lazy, it doesn't get tired, it doesn't get bored of looking at the same old drawings, right? So that was the idea of take away that sort of tedious, mundane work from the human and let them focus on the higher value tasks that help construction companies win more work. So we started off thinking we'd do it just for our construction company. And then we said, holy cow, this applies to every construction company in the world. So we spent about 3 years developing it. We went to market about 2 years ago.
I love it. I think it's sensational. And if I could just reflect on what you were saying, because obviously you've got a fidelity or a quality challenge with AI that you can't ignore. I mean, as you say, garbage in, garbage out, it hallucinates, it makes mistakes. I mean, any number of little problems. But I suppose in your world, I imagine the bid to win ratio or the bid to progress ratio is probably relatively low. In other words, you waste a lot of proposals. And even if it's 20% wrong in the first instance and the customer looks at it and goes, wow, I don't have that kind of money. You're like, great, well, it cost me nickels to figure that out. Or, hey, yeah, that sounds great. Can we refine it somewhat, and you can put your effort into the things that are actually going to result in business for you?
I'd say the industry standard, I'd say is 25 to 30% win rate is kind of normal. Wow. But most plans, you're bidding multiple times. It's rarely that first set of plans that's the final, right? You get something preliminary, maybe it's 20, 30 pages, you give an estimate, and then 6 months later you get something, and then another few months later you get it again. So it's constant bids on the same job. The owners or developers are usually trying to keep people interested, so they're always telling you, oh, you got a chance, this could be yours, right? They're always, kind of stringing you along because they want the competition. But there's also tremendous inefficiency in the process because for each building that's built, you usually have 3, 4, maybe 5 general contractors bidding. And then each of those contractors are sending those plans to 3 or 4 electricians or 5 roofers or 6 window companies or flooring companies or whatever it might be. And so on any given job, you've got 100, 200 plus people bidding on those sets of plans. And they're doing it over and over and over with each revision. So again, it's a very inefficient process. And then it usually doesn't stop there, right? Because you have suppliers and subs of subs and manufacturers and distributors, right? So it just keeps getting passed down and everyone's taking their time to bid on these jobs.
If you were to ask me which industry's least likely to be disrupted by AI, I think construction would have been at the top of the list. So you've blown my mind.
I'll just add something that I didn't think of 5 or 6 years ago, but on that point, since construction has such a low baseline of tech innovation, there's a lot of reasons we don't have to get into, but I believe that AI could arguably disrupt construction more, number one, because there's more room to grow because it's such a low baseline, but number two, because AI finally enables the processing power to interpret the nuance that's in construction, right? All of those revisions I was referring to keep adding a lot more detail, and the plans might go from 20 pages to 2,000 pages, and they each mean something, right? Every line means something for someone unique. That plumber might not care about the electrical work, and this person might not care about the painter versus the floor, but it all matters, right? And it all has to come together in this sort of orchestra in the field. And there's tremendous nuance in those plans with scheduling and pricing and value supply chain, getting things on time, getting the labor, to show up right. All this has to come together. It's a lot of processing power needed. That was never affordable in construction. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden now you've got the processing power to read, understand those spec books, understand those plans, understand the schedules and the supply chains and where the materials are coming from, and bring that all together. So I actually suspect you'll see a tremendous efficiency in construction the next decade because of AI.
Let's get you back on to talk about it. I'm really excited. The fact that you do understand technology and you understand and I think have empathy and sympathy for the real world makes you, I think, uniquely positioned for the work you were doing during your time in service for the American public. You were involved in the last administration's work with AI in the United States. Talk a little bit about what you focused on.
I was on the President's Export Council, which basically the intent is to help American businesses export more product, whatever that might be. I, of course, took a sort of a focus on technology and how America should continue to be a leader in technology, which also means helping to set the standards and the rules for how we're going to engage in this new world of AI and quantum computing. And it's kind of an open field right now, right? People are kind of setting the rules as we're moving along. And it's both one of the most exciting times, I think, in our history, but also one of the scariest, because we don't know what's around the next corner and what new model is going to come out and how it's going to impact our lives. So finding that balance, working within the Department of Commerce, where this group that I was with was on, was a lot of interesting conversations of how we don't fall behind, say, a China that might not care about the rules or regulations. But how do we continue, making sure we find this balance between the Metas and the, Amazons and, the biggest of the big companies, but making sure those small businesses have a chance, right? Togal, our little company, how do we make sure we can survive and compete in this environment where these AI models could be so strong that they could dominate any industry they wanted to, right? So finding that balance. So a lot of really interesting conversations around that. We took a trip to Thailand, actually, as a committee, and talked about all sorts of exports, but technology was certainly top of the list, how data centers are going there and how we continue to collaborate with our top trading partners.
So let's talk a bit about finding that balance, because I guess when we think of, well, I guess the cliche is, you either have regulation or you have innovation, and you can't have both. I personally think that that's false logic. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive, but you do have to think about what I describe as the animal spirits of the market, because we have seen on numerous occasions where organizations aren't regulated that they sometimes push the boundaries of ethics, of legality even, but I would suggest the social license to operate. So do you think the government can be involved in the regulatory process without slowing, well, in your case, American or Australian or German businesses down when it comes to perhaps a less lightly regulated country?
I think you touched on some key things there, right? The data that will be processed, can be processed with AI is just hard to fathom for any regulator. The industries that could be impacted, from defense to intelligence to healthcare and all the privacy concerns that come with that, it's almost hard for any human to wrap their head around what could happen in the next few years. So I think it's very difficult for the smartest person alive to predict what that regulatory environment is going to be. So to your point, I think having the private sector collaborate and involved and really looking at this as more of a public-private partnership, where you've got some of the best and brightest involved in keeping the government officials up to date and up to speed with some of these latest and greatest models and how it's advancing. I don't see another way. Otherwise, private sector is just going to run, run over government. They'll never be able to compete with what's happening. So I also think the government has a lot of weight to throw around. There's, as we know, massive contracts, right? That the federal government has. There's massive opportunity in the government to use AI, and not to get too far off track, but I think it's kind of connected, because if you look at our spending, it's almost $7 trillion a year in the U.S. government and outlays, Social Security and Medicare and defense and the VA and State Department, right? Massive, massive outlays every year. So much of that is just data, right? Just the amount of IRS, right? Think about, our tax system, the amount of paperwork back and forth. How much of that could be automated with AI? The State Department, everyone complains about immigration. I'm not talking about the border crime. I'm not trying to be political. Just processing people's visas, right? Just that component of it. It's a lot of paperwork, right? There's Social Security and Medicare, like so many of the issues that I had to deal with in my office, dealt with as a member of Congress, was paperwork, right? And silly things not being checked. AI is so good at doing that. So I think by enabling small, large, big, whatever businesses of all sizes to come in and take a look at these agencies and say, hey, there's a great way, to drive more efficiencies in our government. Let's get the best and brightest minds. Help us understand the regulatory environment of your companies. And by the way, there might be a really big contract for you to help streamline things. And by the way, taxpayers are going to save a ton of money, right? So to me, it's a much bigger conversation where you can incorporate a lot of this together.
I mean, there's so much to talk about there. Let's start with that balancing act. What do you think? Let's just say that you've got a politician from Germany, Australia's an interesting one. I recently read a report in a local innovation newsletter that's put out, and one of the things they cited was, I think, less than, I'm going to make a statistic up here, but it's directionally accurate, somewhere between 30 and 50%, I think, of government agencies have an AI usage policy in place, for example. And while having a policy in place is not the same thing as regulation, it talks to a mentality that having some sort of guideline or policy is important, and that often will trickle up to government. And then we had an innovation expert on, funnily enough, and a futurist on a couple of weeks ago, and he's got the opposite view, which is government should just keep its nose out of this stuff. I mean, it's got no business talking about technology. How do you? What's your take on it? It's a nuanced problem, it sounds like.
There's no doubt. There's no perfect answer, but you can believe, with the amount of money being thrown around and the disruption that AI is going to cause, that there's going to be regulation. And we're in, I think, a spirit of optimism and hope for AI. I don't think we've seen a ton of downside yet, but when the job disruption starts, and people start going to the politicians saying, what'd you do to protect me, right? All of a sudden, you're going to see a lot more, I think, concern around regulations and how fast things are moving. And forget the security concerns, right? That's a whole nother dynamic, a major hack, a major breach, getting into AI that is all of a sudden AGI that's stronger, more powerful, more intelligent than all humans combined. I don't even know if any of us can fathom the ramifications of that, right? Like, what does our role become when you've got, in all of our, pockets, a PhD in chemistry or biology or engineering or whatever the heck field it is, right? It's just going to lead to potentially massive disruption. So I'm in the camp of getting government involved proactively to try to think about those things and the downside effects and how to best prepare us for it, because the downside could be a lot worse. Additionally, if America is not setting the rules and we're not involved, someone else is going to. And that gentleman that said there shouldn't be regulation, I'm sure would agree that Europe is going to have regulation, or India or XYZ country that he or she might want to sell into one day. And if we're not leading the conversation, then we're going to be following it. And we're going to have to abide by those rules. So then all of a sudden, American businesses are going to have to fit in to every other country's AI policy. And I don't know if we want that either. So I would rather be at the head of the table as a country and getting, sort of our coalition around the table to to have a set of operating rules that we can all agree with, where there is real data security, where there are kill switches, where there's conversations with government around how we're going to retrain and retool because of the potential for mass movements in employment, and how we need to retrain people to find other tasks that might be disrupted very quickly with AI.
If you're talking to industry, you're talking to government at the moment, what's your advice to, say, an industry person who's looking at government going, you know what, they've all come from, they're lawyers, they might be, geophysical engineers, they're anything but technologists. They don't really understand the thing that they're potentially going to regulate. They're going to mess this up. If you're talking to an industry person, what's your advice to them about how to best influence the direction these conversations are going in?
So there's an entity called NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, I want to say, that's put out a preliminary set of guidelines. I would say, depending on your appetite, getting involved, reaching out to them, reaching out to your local member of Congress, your local senator. They would love to hear from experts or people that care in this field, because they're as lost as anybody, right? They're not experts by and large in AI or regulation, right? So hearing from experts is how policy ultimately is made. When I was in DC in that role, I would always rely on my constituents and try to find those experts in industry to help advise, because no human is an expert on everything, right? So go ahead and reach out. They're probably begging to hear from people on the concerns or the downsides of too much regulation, or how maybe some regulation has hurt them in the past. Because these rules are happening sort of as we speak, right? There's various committees and groups that are writing them in Congress, in the Senate, and in these various different entities. There's a real question in DC of which regulatory agency is going to be in charge and how. How do you sort of break that up? So, look, this is going to be a moving target for maybe the rest of our lives, quite frankly, but certainly in the next 5 to 10 years. I think making sure that it's flexible and mendable as we evolve and new models continue to come out is important. But I do think there are some sort of staples that we can all sort of agree with, right? Like the kill switch, I think most people agree. The Terminator scenario, right, could be a lot to comprehend. Let's just unplug the damn thing, right? I'm simplifying it, of course, right? But having the kill switch, the security, what kind of data access, these models are getting into, the privacy, concerns around, especially our healthcare, because God forbid the wrong model, the wrong group got that information. Who knows the impacts of it?
So let's talk a bit about government adoption of this, if you don't mind me moving to the second part of what you mentioned earlier. Agree. I mean, the opportunity to use this technology. I mean, you yourself have done, I guess you've got a sister company, CodeComply, looks at trying to figure out how to navigate the corpus of work that is, so it's on both sides of the house, right? It's like industry wants to know, hey, am I operating within the law? And the government's like, help me administer this whole thing. I was speaking to my wife the other day who made an observation. She's like, she was dealing with the government for something, and she's becoming an Australian citizen, and she's like, oh, this is so frustrating. They know all of this stuff. They've got it here. Why aren't they using it over here? And I said, I had an insight that was given to me. I was in Canberra, Australia's federal capital, at a tech conference, and I learnt from one of the local bureaucrats that while the technology has the capability to do a better job of integrating government, there's a non-zero percentage of the population that likes their government somewhat inefficient, because it means that there's not too much information sharing going on between departments. And I think there are some people who apparently find that comforting. I find it a little bit hard to comprehend. Do you think government as a user of AI is dealing with some of the same sorts of issues that businesses are? How do I automate without being too creepy? How do I anticipate the needs of my citizens without having them feel like I've infringed on their privacy? I guess they've got the same kind of challenges.
100%. And is it accurate? Right. So
good point.
To bring in just what I happen to know best, because I'm working on, is code compliance. So what we're doing is basically taking FHIR life safety, ADA, like handicap requirements for wheelchairs and such, and basically built models to automate if new building plans meet those codes. And as it turns out, the developed world shares about 90% of that. There needs to be fire sprinklers in a certain location, certain capacity in a room. Fire exits can't be more than just say 300 feet away, right? There's all these rules and there's thousands of pages of them. So when you go to get a new building, whether it's a house or an apartment or a hotel approved at your local government, they go through, and I don't know Australia as well, but in the US, it's a 9-month process on average to get those plans approved. And what are these humans doing, right? A lot of them sit there with rulers and they count and they measure how far is this 300 feet or not. And they sit there, right, all day and they go to the next sheet and they go to the next sheet, right, and the next plan. And it's months of work. It's really easy for a computer to do that and it's really accurate, right? So why not have the computers automate all that work and then let the humans focus on maybe the gray area? Maybe there's a question, maybe it's a really complicated job, maybe it's unique, whatever it might be. Let the human focus on that. And instead of taking 9 months to approve something, let's take 9 days and let's get things built faster, right? Let's go ahead and help with the workforce housing crisis and help bring down costs, because that time there ends up costing a lot of money because there's interest and carrying costs and employees and all that. So anyway, the pushback is, well, what if it's not accurate? How do we handle that? And so in our particular scenario, it's very visual. The human can lay eyes on what the AI did and decide if it's right or not. But if it's, just say, I'm just using an easy example, taxes, and the AI is processing, 10 million tax returns, are you gonna go check every single one? How do you do that, right? Like put your eyes on every single one and process just the sheer amount of information that humans are processing today. So getting the confidence is definitely going to take some time. There's ways to do that, obviously, and it's going to continue to get more and more accurate, and it's not going to be overnight. It's going to start small and of course grow as people get more confidence. But if I think about what is happening in the US today, and again, I'm trying not to get too political, but there's an attempt, Elon Musk with Doge, right, and the government efficiency, and basically just cutting, whole agencies, just terminating them and every employee there. I think another approach that I'd be an advocate for is let's use technology to make those agencies more efficient, and keep the humans that have a lot of knowledge around them, and then build some great models that are hugely scalable to drive those efficiencies. I'm a little surprised that wasn't the approach given Elon's background, but I'm not in the room, so maybe there's more to it.
Well, and to that point, do you see the tone of, because you talked about your work with the previous administration, do you see an orthogonality between those two things? In other words, they're basically looking at the regulatory posture completely different. It's kind of like drill baby drill of AI. Do you see some of the somewhat cautious and considered approach carrying forward? What's your take on what to expect out of the United States? Because so goes the United States in some respects, so goes the rest of the world.
And I think it's true, really, globally. To your point, Paul, and those animal spirits you alluded to earlier seem to be spreading their wings across the world quickly. Mm-hmm. Pendulum usually swings, and right now seems to be an environment. And again, I can speak to the U.S. a bit better than I can Australia. The group of advisors that President Trump has surrounded himself are definitely more in the camp of free those spirits. Let industry prevail. The capitalist markets will, balance it out ultimately. So I would expect fewer regulations when it comes to things like AI, and let the dust settle. Who knows? But that's, I think, where we're going. And I think globally we're seeing a lot. I think we're seeing certain people elected that are more in that camp of deregulation.
Yeah, I suppose to your point, it's only going to take a major upset or a major. The law is often a lagging indicator of
Unfortunately, it's reactive, not proactive, right?
Yeah.
Always, right?
Well, and look,
After
proactive law kind of sucks too, right? Because you can overestimate a threat that's not really there. Neither is correct, I suppose. You've got to find a.
as a CPA, one of my jobs at Deloitte was dealing with Sarbanes-Oxley right after Enron and WorldCom, and there were these huge financial frauds. Right, they passed Sarbanes-Oxley, and that was one of my first sort of eye openers to what the federal government was doing because of a good intent, but in my interpretation of what I was actually doing to implement it, it was very different than the intent of it. And I don't necessarily know if Sarbanes-Oxley was the best solution for solving those financial frauds. Maybe. Dodd-Frank, right after 2008, the banking and mortgage collapse, another round of regulations, the CFPB, all these things. So usually it is reactive, and sometimes the pendulum does swing far. The impact of AI could be far, the downside, right? The negative impact of AI could be far worse than those two, which is a bit scary. So hopefully there is some modest regulation that enables U.S. animal spirits to run free and keep the hopeful lead on China and other competitors, but protect the American citizens.
Let's sort of wrap up with let's bifurcate this. So there's again a significant portion of the population. There was a recent survey that unfortunately I do not have to hand, so I will we'll see if we can put it in the show notes, that basically highlighted that significant 75%, I think, of the population of the US are concerned about the impact of AI on them. The concern's not specific. It's just generally, I'm worried, I'm nervous, I've watched too much Terminator, I'm concerned this thing's going to take over. What do you say to them to allay their fears? And then the second part of it is, what do you say to the governments, the regulators, the businesses who are like, oh, it'll be right, mate, don't worry about it, we'll be fine. What could go wrong? What do you say to those two camps? What do you say to the pessimists and the people who are concerned about AI, and what do you say to the folks who are like, we have no need for regulation? How would you wrap it up?
I'd say I think a lot of people's concern is over their own welfare, their own job, right? That they're thinking of personally, which they should. And I would just point to some interesting stats, and don't quote me exactly, but in the 1950s, right, poverty was 40-50% in the world. 80s it went down to 20-30%, and today it's in the low teens. Right, and since then we've had computers and the internet and all sorts of technology. But what's happened is the world has become richer. The middle class has grown, enormously around the world. Right, so more and more people are getting better jobs. And if you think of just individually, employment and wages are set as a lever as an indicator of productivity. And if artificial intelligence and technology, almost by definition, are going to make people more productive, then they're going to make more money, right? Their salaries are going to be more. It might not be the job they're in today, but as the saying goes, AI won't replace you, but the person using AI will, right? So get on board, learn the tools, educate yourself. There's hundreds of free tools out there on the internet to start learning. Take an hour a week to start getting up to speed with how AI might impact your job, and be that leader in whatever field it is, for how you can adopt it. That would be my advice. The differences in previous waves of technology, whether that's the going from horse and buggy to the car, or the internet, whatever it might be, ATMs, is this one's happening really fast, right? Each sort of new technology wave happens a lot faster. So we need to move, I believe, much faster as leaders in community, government, charities, all of the above, to help ensure that training and retooling is there for the workforce, for that disruption. So ultimately, I think it shakes out and we end up in better, more satisfied jobs that are paying us all more, but it could be a rocky road.
And what do you say to the business maximalists who are just like, leave me alone, I don't need your stinking regulation?
I appreciate where they're coming from. I certainly understand it, but I think we are stronger together. All rising tides should be lifting all boats. And there's going to be plenty to go around. There's plenty of disruption, and AI is going to enable a lot of people to make a lot of money. Let's try to protect those that are most vulnerable along the way.
Last but not least, well, hoping we get you back. So hopefully it's not the last. I want to talk to you a bit more about applying AI to interesting industries. What do you think is the biggest opportunity, and what do you think the most pressing challenges are when it comes to AI in total?
As we were just saying, I think there's going to be a lot of money made. I think there's going to be all sorts of interesting business problems solved, and all sorts of industries that you and I probably could never dream. But I would think healthcare could be just the most impactful, right? If you don't have health, what else really matters, right? Whether it's you or your family, the loved ones around you. AI is already massively disrupting it for the positive, right? Where you have decades of research happening in days, right? Where you have clinical trials, new drugs getting to clinical trial months or years faster than they ever would have. Being able to understand these protein formations and different drug, customizations for each of our body types is going to completely revolutionize healthcare. And many are predicting, similar to what we were saying about regulations, that healthcare will move from a reactive to proactive mindset, which will save so much money for all of us, and diagnose, God forbid, cancer, say, in early days, even before stage 1 is even there. Early days, before it gets to that stage 4, stage 5, where it's very expensive or untreatable. And that sort of chronic care, we're going to become much better at handling that, I believe. Then you layer in sort of the quantum computing with AI. And I think in the next decade, a lot of ailments we have today that have affected so many of us and our families are going to be behind us and solved. That ultimately, I think, will lead to more productive, longer lifespans for a lot of people. And that retirement age, right, it calls into all sorts of interesting questions about, are you really retiring at 75 or 80 or whatever? Nowadays, if you're living a productive life until you're 120, right, like what happens? They're saying the first person to ever live to 150 years old is born and walking somewhere in the world today. 150 years old, right? Like that's crazy to think about what that does to all sorts of actuarial tables and employment and, marriage and life and love and everything. So I think health is going to disrupt, again, hopefully for the positive, and give us all better, happier, more productive lives.
Well, you've certainly ended the podcast on a tremendously optimistic note. Patrick, thank you so much for joining us. I really do appreciate you taking the time here. Thank you again, Cloudera, for hosting another episode of the AI Forecast. And thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you all next week.